Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Lachlan. I am really glad that I actually wrote invalidating environments, not treatments, so that's lucky. I'd like to begin also by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, the Cabrogal people of the Dorning Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. So following on from Dr. Corner, I'll be presenting the case of Layla, just to provide insight into how traits of borderline personality disorder may manifest in refugee and asylum seeker populations, and to consider the overlap between presentations indicative of BPD and complex PTSD, an emerging diagnostic category for people exposed to prolonged and severe traumatic events. Layla is not the real name of this client, and I've changed some of the other key details in this presentation to keep her identity safe. So the aims of this evening's presentation are to acknowledge pervasive emotion dysregulation as the common mechanism present in both complex PTSD and BPD traits in refugees and asylum seekers, and also to draw on the case of Layla to share an integrated and eclectic potential treatment approach that was targeted at this dysregulation rather than specific diagnostic criteria. So Layla is a 35-year-old woman. She was born and grew up in Tehran, the capital of Iran. She's currently single and converted to Christianity shortly after her arrival in Australia. Layla arrived in Australia by boat in 2011, seeking asylum. She currently holds a 3-year temporary protection visa, or a TPV, and was referred to STARTS by her Red Cross caseworker in 2016 when she moved from Brisbane to Sydney to live. We've completed 44 sessions together, and these have been conducted in English. Layla is the eldest of 3 children, all of whom are now adults. Layla's family are of high status and are quite wealthy in Iran. She initially travelled to Australia with her sister, where they were both held in immigration detention for 18 months. Approximately 2 years after their arrival in Australia, Layla was re-detained for 2 to 3 months due to a problem with her visa. And during this time, her sister actually returned to Iran without telling her. She'd found it really difficult to cope with the restrictions placed on her in Australia. This understandably left Layla feeling very hurt and abandoned. Layla remains close with her mother and her brother, speaking regularly to them over the phone, but has very little contact with her father or her sister due to their personal differences. Layla was in a de facto relationship here in Sydney for the last 3 years. It ended 6 months ago of her own accord. So a majority of the initial information about Layla's traumatic experiences were obtained from referrers and previous psychological assessment reports that had actually been completed while she was in immigration detention. Layla avoided conversations about her traumatic experiences until much later in treatment. So I relied on this, previous information to guide my knowledge and my assessment. So Layla experienced multiple instances of childhood sexual assault when she was about 6 years of age and then again at 9 years of age. These were perpetrated by people known to her but were not family members. Layla believes her mother was aware of the instances that occurred when she was 6 and would at times say to me that I don't know why my mother didn't do anything to help, and then also would sympathetically acknowledge at other times the position that her mother was in and the understanding she had for her mother's limited capacity to intervene in any way. From a young age, Layla disliked the conservative Islamic rule of Iran and refused to engage in the religious practices there that are the norm. As the environment did not allow for her unique self-expression, she felt invalidated and different, like she didn't fit into society. Layla described strong feelings of anger throughout her adolescence, and this caused her to engage in rebellious behaviours like drinking alcohol, substance use, not attending school, and regularly staying outside of the home. As Layla grew older, she became more outspoken in her dislike of Islam and began attending protests government protests, and becoming involved in activist groups. She would post negative stories and comments about the government online. And as such, in 2010, she was arrested and detained due to her involvement in such activities. She was physically beaten by authorities and again sexually assaulted. It was shortly after this that she left to Australia to seek protection. After she arrived in Australia, as I mentioned earlier, her and her sister were detained on Christmas Island for about 18 months. During this time, her psychological health deteriorated and she began taking antidepressant medication and experiencing suicidal ideation. When Layla was first referred to STARTS, she had already received significant psychological interventions whilst living in Brisbane. These were particularly for symptoms of chronic suicidal ideation and attempts, as well as self-harm behaviour. At the time of her referral to STARTS, she was also transferred into the care of the community mental health team. But her case manager there went on leave shortly after she was referred, and she didn't really like her replacement, so her treatment with them ceased. At the time of her referral, Layla was taking multiple different types of prescription medication. These included olanzapine, an antipsychotic, Effexor, an antidepressant, and opiate-based pain medication for a hip injury, particularly something called a fentanyl pain patch, which are about 80 to 100 times stronger than morphine. When I first met Layla, she appeared slim and of an average build. She made very little eye contact, had slightly pressured speech, and was restless and fidgety, always sitting on the edge of her chair. Initially, she was very focused on seeking help to solve her environmental stresses and her visa in particular. During our initial sessions, she was like a closed book. She would only allow me to view the pages that she chose, which at the time were only to do with her visa and her intense feelings of despair and anger at the immigration department. Layla presented with typical PTSD, depression and anxiety symptoms, such that her scores on standardised assessment tools indicated the severity of these was clinically significant. And as assessment continued, it became clear that she was also experiencing pervasive emotion dysregulation. Layla's pervasive emotion dysregulation difficulties manifested in symptoms and functional problems that could fit into either or both of the BPD or proposed complex PTSD diagnostic criteria as outlined by the ICD-10. And specifically, these included intense feelings of emotion, anger outbursts, interpersonal difficulties with both service providers and in the form of chaotic intimate relationships, fear of being alone, which resulted in her persisting in unhelpful relationships, intense feelings of shame and self-loathing, impulsivity in the form of driving too fast and aggressive behaviour, inability to tolerate her intense emotional distress, and subsequent numbing behaviour through the use of excess prescription medication, complete withdrawal from others, and chronic suicidal ideation. And so this complex interaction model helps us to see how multiple cumulative factors have interacted over time and impacted on Layla's current psychological health and coping capacity. We've already discussed a majority of each aspect of these factors individually, but an additional important characteristic to consider is the transactional nature of these factors and how consistently throughout Layla's life there was a mismatch between her needs and the reality of her environment. An example of this mismatch between is the mismatch between Layla's view of the world and the conservative religious rule in Iran, where Layla would act in a way that was not consistent with the religious laws, seeking freedom and creative expression, and then when found to be behaving in this way would be reprimanded punitively. As a result, her feelings of difference and not fitting in were invalidated and dismissed, and her behaviour to target the flaws of the government and religious authorities was then reinforced and strengthened. Alan Frazzetti's transactional model, which is based on that of Marsha Linehan, demonstrates the reinforcing nature of Layla's ingrained emotional responses and how intransaction with others may elicit invalidation. So if we begin at the top of this model, we can see that it's been established that Layla was vulnerable to intense emotion, which could contribute directly to heightened emotional arousal, or at times might be triggered by specific events. An example of this was when she was granted refugee status, but because the process had taken so long, she was only eligible for a TPV, despite her original application being for a permanent visa. Layla judged this event as another way the immigration department had been playing with her and making her suffer, which contributed to intense feelings of sadness, hurt, and despair. Layla then inaccurately expressed her feelings of sadness, disappointment, and despair as anger, presenting to service providers with aggressive behaviour, being blaming of her lawyer and verbally abusive towards her partner. Unfortunately, those people only saw her expression of anger and missed the primary emotions that she was feeling, causing them to unknowingly respond with invalidation, like her lawyer refusing to take calls from her, service providers calling the police or asking her to leave the premises, and her partner being verbally abusive back to her rather than supportive. Such invalidating responses would then have a tendency to heighten Layla's emotional arousal even further and lead to her numbing behaviours like medication and substance use, suicidal thoughts, or other attempts to block out the intense emotional pain. I believe that this transaction process occurred in a range of circumstances throughout Layla's life, perpetuating over time. So if I'm completely honest, my initial case formulation was definitely not as clear as this. Early in treatment, it felt as though we were putting out spot fires and managing crises in every session. And my understanding and assessment of Layla developed over time as I was slowly able to put together small pieces of important information. When considering this case and formulating our treatment plan, I took into account Layla's early life and traumatic experiences, including her abuse, an early invalidating environment, and the complex social fabric of Iran. I hypothesised how these contributed to Layla's heightened distress profile, impacted on her development of identity, and were reinforced by her feeling different and out of place in Iran. I proposed that this resulted in a polarity of coping responses which oscillate either from complete avoidance and numbing to the fight response or that of behaviour escalation. This, along with further invalidation of a lengthy detention and multiple rejections on her visa application because she was believed not to be credible, have contributed to Layla's pervasive emotion regulation difficulties. And despite her hardship, Layla displays multiple protective factors. She's a super sensor. She's incredibly attentive to her environment, reads people very well, and is adept at getting others to help meet her needs when she can't do it herself. She's remained close with her mother, who has been a significant reason that she hasn't ended her life. She has an emerging insight into the patterns in her distress and coping behaviour, which has really benefited our most recent treatment. And so interestingly, like the BPD and complex PTSD diagnostic criteria, there's a significant overlap in two of the common evidence-based treatment approaches, as can be seen here in the phases of treatment proposed by Herman and Linehan. In line with my knowledge base and my experience, as well as the fact that I work at STARTS, where we are experts in working with complex refugee trauma, I chose to draw on Judith Herman's staged approach when working with Layla, but also kept Linehan's vast array of DBT, distress tolerance and emotion regulation skills in the back of my mind. Early on in treatment, the focus was on supporting Layla to develop a sense of both external and internal safety. This was a really challenging period of treatment. Layla presented with chronic suicidal ideation and despair. She would tell me these really specific plans of how she might try to kill herself, often scenarios that would be public in order to send a message to immigration about the suffering they had caused her. She was regularly hospitalised but couldn't tolerate hospital, so would only stay 1 to 2 days at a time, receiving inadequate treatment. And community mental health involvement fluctuated, their staff frequently changed, and Layla didn't like engaging with them, so when they came to visit, she would tell them that she was fine. During this time, Layla occasionally presented to session quite drowsy, had very little eye contact and even slurred speech. On multiple occasions, I queried her about her medication use and substance use, and she would explain it away as taking a higher than usual dose of her prescription medication because she hadn't slept the night before. However, this pattern persisted. On 1 or 2 occasions, Layla was quite blaming of me and very upset with me for calling the crisis team or emergency services to her home. I did my best to remain neutral and validate her feelings whilst reminding her of my professional limits. This seemed to be effective as she became increasingly able to tell me directly when she felt she needed to go to hospital and was better able to manage her safety. During this treatment phase, my interventions included spending a lot of time building trust through taking a non-judgmental stance and validation of Layla's distress, experiences, and ongoing stresses, doing my best to set limits and safety plan, providing psychoeducation about the impact of trauma and the potential negative impact of self-medicating, and a lot of liaison with mental health crisis teams, emergency services, and hospital psychiatrists. Following a successful ministerial intervention application and a chance to submit new information, Layla was granted a TPV 6 years after she arrived in Australia. As mentioned previously, this was a very difficult time for her. She found it hard to accept, and some months later, it seemingly had very little positive impact on her psychological health. However, slowly, with some psychoeducation and time, she did develop acceptance for it and managed to visit her family overseas last year. During this initial period of treatment, I regularly felt confused and unsure. It felt like treatment was not progressing in any way, and that I was like someone watching from the outside, looking in, who had very little capacity to change what they were seeing. About 18 months into treatment, Layla disclosed that she'd commenced a methadone program. She said it was to help her stop using the fentanyl pain patches. I had suspected for some time that she had a polysubstance use problem, but whenever I brought it up, she would deny it emphatically. Being on the methadone program helped to stabilise Layla's substance use problems somewhat, and she presented more alert in session. This enabled us to begin to focus treatment on behaviour activation strategies and healthy living routines to help improve her mood and sleep-wake cycles and better regulate her intense emotions. Layla didn't like being on methadone. She felt ashamed of it and as such frequently tried to reduce it a lot faster than was recommended. This caused physical withdrawal symptoms, heightened emotional distress, and erratic behaviour. Slowly, Layla became more open with me about her substance use, eventually explaining her long history of opiate use, which began in Iran, and that she continued to use substances even whilst on methadone. She explained that she'd been too ashamed of her substance use to tell me and concerned about the potential impact of it on her visa. The openness to talk about the behaviour really aided treatment, as we could focus on identifying triggers for her intense emotional pain and explore the pattern and function of her substance use behaviour, which was to block out and numb from her intense emotional distress. Whilst this was really helpful for progress in treatment, knowing more about Layla's substance use at times left me feeling really worried for her safety. Every now and then, Layla would miss an appointment with me and not call or text me for a couple of weeks. I would attempt to check in with her without much response, and at times would have to request police to conduct a welfare check at her home. Layla's honesty about her substance use allowed me to recommend her for specific drug and alcohol counselling. After previously being really reluctant to engage with external services, she agreed and attended both individual and group sessions. She also began considering her options to cease using substances, and with the help of her drug and alcohol counsellor, trialled detox programs and explored options for residential rehabilitation. Over a period of months and a few stops and starts, Layla managed to cease using all substances, including methadone. She attends NA meetings every day, has a sponsor, and has started the 12-step program. Our treatment has shifted significantly as a result, and whilst we continue to focus on consolidating skills, we've also been able to commence work on acknowledging the significant impact of her past traumatic experiences and the regret and shame she feels about how her behaviour may have also negatively impacted others. And so there were some treatment outcomes that occurred or sort of progressed slowly throughout our work together. One of those was the intensity of Layla's suicidal ideation and attempts, and her hospital admissions reduced gradually over time. As a result, probably in the last 18 months, she hasn't needed to attend hospital at all. In the past 6 months since ceasing substance use, Layla's progress in treatment has been exponential. The severity of her self-report PTSD, anxiety and depression symptoms have all reduced significantly. She's better able to regulate her intense feelings of emotion, reports less anger. She said to me on Friday that she only puts her rude finger up maybe once a week now. She has increased hope for her future and has actually started working part-time and studying at TAFE last month. Despite the significant progress Layla has made in treatment, there remains work to do to ensure such gains can be maintained. There are plans for her to attend a DBT skills group to help both with her interpersonal skills, distress tolerance and emotion regulation. She's interested in continuing our work in processing and acknowledging the impact of her past experiences on her current emotional states and coping responses. And so as this diagram suggests, and I guess as the presentation sort of also indicates, pervasive emotion dysregulation creates dysregulation in multiple other facets of life, including beliefs about the world and self, relationships and dysregulated behaviour. And it typically develops as a result of a predisposition to intense feelings of emotion, or can develop over time within an invalidating or traumatic environment. The characteristics of the complex social political factors and cumulative trauma that many refugees and asylum seekers may be exposed to are all factors which may contribute to enduring emotion dysregulation. Such enduring and complex presentations may benefit from an integrated staged approach to treatment, incorporating emotion regulation skills, validation and non-judgment. Layla summed up her experience of emotion dysregulation as doing life is really difficult for me. The simple things are so hard, I would just think it would be easier to die. And then on Friday last week, when we last met, after about 2.5 years of treatment, she told me, now I believe in myself and I want to see what I'm capable of. I'd like to finish by reflecting on Layla's survival skills. Although at times these have seemed risky and ineffective, they have served her in coping with intense emotional pain that would be difficult for most of us to imagine. She's been a teacher for me, a river guide, helping me navigate through the path that is complex trauma and pervasive emotion dysregulation. Layla helped me to better set limits, use my own self-regulation skills, and to learn what is effective and what's not in working with presentations like hers. Thank you for coming, guys.